Welcome to Capital Murder, where we discuss murder that happened in capital cities. I remember the first time I felt fear. I was 5 years old in the summer of '85, and my older brother was telling us about the Night Stalker. And although most of his crimes were committed in Southern California, being a young girl growing up in Northern California, the idea of this man seemed all too real. Someone who could potentially sneak into your house at night and do unthinkable things as you slept. Our brother didn't go into detail about just what those things were, but I still felt this undeniable fear. There were a few nights that summer where I recall sleeping on my parents' bedroom floor in a sleeping bag, trying to burrow under their bed. Fortunately, Richard Ramirez's reign of terror didn't last long, but the idea always hung around in the back of my mind. As I aged, I'd find myself drawn to study this behavior, always wondering just what makes these broken people needlessly lash out at strangers to satisfy some sort of emptiness within. My young mind at the time found comfort in knowing that there were these seeming precautions one could take to avoid a run-in with these people. I learned to be called serial killers. Don't talk to strangers. Don't put yourself in any unknown situations. And most importantly, lock all your doors and windows before going to bed at night. As a child, these guidelines helped ease my ever-overthinking, anxious brain, and life moved on smoothly. Well, that is, until 1988. The news broke about Dorothea Puente, and this time it was right in my hometown of Sacramento. My worst nightmare came around to shake me. Here we had a harmless-looking little old lady who was only 2 years older than my own grandmother. Someone I easily would have trusted without a second thought. And what's worse, she was killing within her own house. Until that moment, I never realized a monster could actually live within. Puente was born January 9th, 1929 in Redlands, California. Both her parents were alcoholics. Her dad would often talk about suicide. Reports state they both abused her. Her dad died of tuberculosis when Puente was 8. Mom lost custody and then died in a motorcycle accident when Puente was 9. She was then sent to an orphanage where she was sexually abused. She was married by the time she turned 16 and had 2 kids by 19. One kid was sent to live with family in Sacramento. The other put up for adoption. Puente was arrested at 19 for check forgery. She spent 4 months in jail, 3 years probation. She began her second marriage at age 23 and changed her name and identity. Her husband would travel for work, so she'd use the time to invite men to her home to gamble. She stayed under the radar until the age of 31, when she was arrested for running a brothel. She served 90 days. At the age of 32, her husband had her committed for heavy drinking, lying, criminal behavior, and suicide attempts. She was diagnosed a pathological liar, but of course, no one did anything about it. Puente opened a halfway house and became seen as a beacon of the community. She established herself and her home as a safe haven for the homeless, mentally ill, and alcoholics. She'd hold AA meetings and help others sign up for Social Security benefits. In 1978, she was charged with illegally cashing 34 checks that belonged to her tenants. She got 5 years probation and had to pay $4,000 in restitution. In April 1982, Ruth Monroe, Puente's business partner, died of an apparent overdose at the age of 61. It was ruled a suicide because Puente told the authorities she was depressed. Weeks later, Malcolm McKenzie accused Puente of drugging him and stealing from him. In August of '82, Puente was convicted of 3 counts of theft and sentenced to 5 years in prison. While in prison, Puente began a pen-pal relationship with 77-year-old Everson Gilmouth. He picked her up from prison when she was released, and one thing led to another. In November 1985, Puente hired a handyman to build her a human-sized box to store books and other items. She paid the handyman $800 and Gilmouth's truck to help her dispose of the box, which was dumped on the side of the highway. Gilmouth's body was discovered 2 months later, but he wasn't identified for 3 years. Puente collected his pension checks the whole time and wrote to his family, making excuses for his lack of replies. Bert Montoya spent years living on the streets and in shelters, due in large part to untreated mental disorders, including schizophrenia. Because Puente had such a high reputation in the community for being a shelter for the elderly, sick, and mentally ill, many social workers would refer their clients to her boarding house. I always feel it's important to highlight the victims and pay respects to their memory and loved ones left behind. 64-year-old Dorothy Miller was last seen in October 1987. She was an Army vet, and Puente used her ID to get medical treatment. In 1987, 78-year-old Leona Carpenter died from an overdose. It was assumed to be a suicide, but those who knew her said she was too weak and ill to retrieve the medication on her own. In 1988, Benjamin Fink, 55, vanished. He was last seen when Puente told another tenant she was going to take Ben upstairs and make him feel better. Also in 1988, Bert Montoya vanished. He was a schizophrenic who was rumored to help Puente dig holes in her yard and basement. Montoya's social worker obviously noticed him missing and questioned Puente. The social worker didn't believe Puente's lies regarding his alleged whereabouts, so they contacted the authorities. During the initial investigation, Puente was not immediately a suspect, so she got a hotel room near her place. She left her house to walk to the hotel alone and ended up fleeing to the Los Angeles area. Authorities continued to search Puente's place in her absence. 78-year-old Betty Palmer's body was found in Puente's backyard, missing its head, hands, and feet. Before moving in with Puente, James Gallup, 62, had survived a heart attack and brain surgery to remove a tumor. Vera Faye Martin, 64, was believed to have been buried alive based on the dirt patterns around her grave. While on the run, Puente hit up some man in a restaurant who recognized her from the news and called the cops. Puente was convicted of 3 of the murders, although the jury could not agree on the other 6. She spent the rest of her life in prison and continued to maintain her innocence, insisting that all of her boarders had died of natural causes. Puente died at Chowchilla Prison on March 27, 2011, from natural causes. She was 82 and a horrible human being,